Thank you. Hello. Nice to see everybody. I hope you've all had a chance to have a coffee and explore and a chat. I know talks are really just a gap in the chat, so we'll get you back there as soon as we can. So I'm Verity McIntosh. I'm a senior lecturer and researcher at Bristol, looking particularly at virtual and extended realities. To help me judge a little bit, who in this room has had a little play with anything that might be regarded as sort of immersive tech or immersive storytelling? That's not bad. Ace. Well, I will endeavour to kind of join that conversation with you then. So what I'm speaking to you about a bit today is the sort of distinctive collaborative potential that we're seeing in virtual and extended realities. As many of you will know, it's kind of a new frontier for a lot of designers. It's a really interesting space in terms of human-computer interface and how we design for people who are going to be experiencing the world through all these different mediated technologies. And as makers and as practitioners and as thinkers, it's an opportunity to kind of revisit what we mean by collaboration and try and figure out what we can carry through from what has existed before and what feels new to this space. So to give you a little bit of a frame for what I guess I'm talking about in terms of immersive stuff, there are obviously quite a lot of things within that umbrella and we won't get to all of them today. But to give you a little bit of a flavour of what I think is kind of exciting and possible with some of these tools, I'm just going to give you a few cheeky examples. So one of the most powerful things that these immersive technologies can do, from my point of view, is allow you to tell stories. When you're present in a virtual reality experience, for example, you are absolutely in the centre of a story. Quite literally, you can look around, you can look up and down, very often you can walk around in the space. You are now the sort of protagonist in your favourite movie. You are the player in this game. You are the person who is literally central to this experience. And it's a very different paradigm to what we might be more used to with screen-based media, where you are sort of separate from a rectangle. You might be very immersed in this rectangle, but there's a rectangle nonetheless, and you are always aware that there is this rectangle and there is you. Whereas in immersive realities, very often that kind of boundary, that frame, really dissolves for you, and you end up committing quite quickly. We are very, very silly beings. We commit very quickly to this sort of optical and audio illusion that is presented to us. And we have what's often referred to as a sense of being there, this kind of psychologically plausible reality that allows us to imagine ourselves as embodied characters who have agency in the space, who have influence, and who are effectively now, we kind of project our mental selves into these embodied characters that exist within the story. The piece behind me, Wolves in the Wall, is awesome. Do have a look if you get a chance. It's based on a Neil Gaiman story. And this is Lucy, and you are her imaginary friend. You exist because she drew you in chalk. That's one of your first experiences, is you materialise because she imagined you. And throughout the experience, because you are in a headset and holding controllers, she's able to look you bang in the eye. She knows exactly where you're looking, and she looks at you, and she speaks to you, and she takes you on adventures, and she asks for your help. So it's a very kind of role-play type paradigm that allows you to really invest and elaborate on stories in really interesting ways. We often see sort of subtle distinctions being made between what might be called kind of CGI virtual reality and what sometimes gets called 360 film, which can both be really potent mediums. And a lot of documentary makers are really moving into 360 media at the moment as a way to, again, kind of use that sense of presence to really bring a story, bring journalism, bring documentary to a viewer so that they can have a sort of an empathic response to that story. This is an amazing piece called Travelling While Black by Roger Ross Williams that accompanied a feature film of the same name, which allows you to kind of be in Ben's Diner, which is a really central location within the story of the history of Black Americans being safe and unsafe in their travels across the nation. And it allows you to sit with people as they tell their stories and to be in the booth with them and to have all of those kind of complex emotions about your right to be there, what you hear and what testimony means in that space. There you go. When we move into kind of more augmented reality paradigms, whether through the phone or in wearable devices, as in this case for HoloLens, it allows you to bring digital storytelling or digital artifacts into your everyday experience of the real world. So potentially if I had a little kind of augmented reality kit here, I could sort of see your names popping up above, so I could chat to you by name. I'd be able to place digital participants in these empty chairs if they were connecting remotely. It allows you to effectively kind of incorporate your everyday view with digital components, whether that's information or more experiential work. In this amazing project, Nomad project by Abira Hussain and Nemesine, They wanted to work with the National Library to bring a lot of the artefacts that were kind of behind glass cases and on dusty shelves that were related to migratory populations, particularly nomadic populations, and give context and story to those objects. They're sort of not touchable in real life, and so what they did in this case was did magical 3D scans of all of these amazing kind of cultural artefacts, recreated them in 3D, and then allowed you to view them, to touch them, to move them, to interact with them through these sort of augmented reality viewers. And they actually took it a step further. If you chose that object, for example, you can kind of look and understand something about the pattern and the shapes and the colours. But you can also, if you spend enough time with it and show it the due respect, you can unlock a story of a Somali woman who talks about the fact that for her grandparents, it was a way of sleeping as you travel. So it's a neck rest, and it allows you to kind of make your camp wherever you may be. So objects become kind of story keepers, and this augmented view allows you to kind of unlock some of the richness of those stories. I imagine you're seeing this. This is my new dance. I feel like there's a Wizard of Oz. There you are. One use case that you may have come across yourselves many times now, it's really proliferated in the last few years, is this idea of using immersive technologies for training and learning. There's lots and lots of studies that have gone on to suggest that if we go through what might otherwise be quite kind of procedural training processes in company policy, in kind of tools use, in all sorts of different contexts, if we do so in virtual reality as opposed to doing it as kind of an e-learning module, or even sometimes as a kind of in-person experience, that we incorporate that a lot more strongly as physical memory. So there's lots of modules that are being developed to support people to use these tools in kind of replicable ways around the world, particularly for multinational companies, to do company onboarding, to do skills training, and increasingly to do sort of soft skills training. So Body Swaps here do some amazing work where they look at leadership training, they look at unconscious bias, lots of things we've been talking about today. They look at ways to respond to harassment in the workplace. And what they do is they use these really janky looking graphics to effectively kind of put you in a position in a scenario, give you a number of different options as to how you might respond, listen to the words that you use as you respond, for example, in a kind of a disciplinary hearing, use machine language processing to kind of echo back to you how what you said might be interpreted and what you might want to choose differently, and how the kind of the tone of voice that you chose might have either escalated or de-escalated a situation. So you get kind of live feedback about how you have behaved through your body language and your voice. But they do an extra layer there where they then swap you into the body of the person that you were notionally speaking to. So suddenly you're over here watching yourself talk to yourself. And it is the most uncanny experience of your life to suddenly see yourself and your own body language and your own cadence as though you were someone else, and to be spoken to by yourself. It can be quite jarring. It's a bit like hearing your voice on the radio. It's like, that's not me, I promise. But it's an incredibly strong learning curve to be able to do what we call kind of perspective switching, and to be able to take the literal point of view of someone who is not your common self. So it's finding lots of useful utility there. And then, of course, massive amounts of brand activity and brand activation, particularly as we're moving into this conversation about metaverse that you've probably heard more than you're willing to at this point. Metaverse has been a bit of a buzzword since Facebook decided to kind of own the brand. But the potential to have these kind of mass collections of humans across the world in a sort of a socially real environment, to be able to have collaboration across massive distances, to be able to have these kind of coalescing spaces in this sort of digital spatial paradigm, is really exciting for a lot of brands. And so a lot of brand partnerships have been springing up recently, trying to make use of this kind of proto-metaverse moment that we're in now. This was a piece by Yahoo with Selfridges and designer Charlie Cohen, and with Pokemon, so a huge kind of cross-brand collaboration. And what they did was they made a sort of a metaverse, maybe, fashion capital that could be visited via the desktop or via headsets. And in this fashion capital, you could go to gigs, you could go to runway shows, you could go to retail environments, and they were effectively selling two types of fashion product. They were selling the new collection that was a collaboration between Charlie Cohen and Pokemon, that you could just go, hey, that looks cool, I'll buy it and it will turn up in my house in a couple of weeks. But you could also buy digital clothing. So they had kind of catwalks for clothing that was going to be physical and clothing that could only ever exist in a digital world. And by buying that clothing in the digital world, you allow your avatar to be clothed in that way. And we're seeing more and more of this, particularly in that kind of fashion environment where people are thinking about the digital assets that they would like for themselves that will only ever exist in digital spaces. Oh yeah, oh God, I'm really, really big, aren't I? I guess like the huge kind of fast, I feel like I should stop this before, no, forget it. The biggest like giant in the industry right now, virtual reality, mixed reality, headset-based stuff is all kind of bubbling away in the background. But the absolute kind of ubiquitous giant of the sector right now is the AR filter, whether that's kind of facial filters or environment filters. They are huge, they are everywhere to the extent that most people wouldn't regard them as immersive tech. They're just a thing that you do on social media or a way to share information with your friends. And obviously we've got spectacular amounts of, that's really disturbing, spectacular amounts of brand tie-in also coming into this AR space. Within the pandemic, we noticed a massive trend towards virtual try-on, where people either couldn't or didn't want to go into a retail environment to try on clothing, for example. So this ability to kind of point your phone at your foot and see what that particular trainer might look like for you, to be able to try on new clothing, to be able to try on new sunglasses, it was a massive kind of shift that we're not seeing any return from as things tend to ease. So it's not going away. It's really easy to do. Facial filters are like super easy to make, and it's becoming an incredibly kind of ubiquitous use case, particularly for the younger generation, and a bit of an onboarding for a lot of people into immersive tech. That is enough of that. Okay, so we're here to talk about collaboration. So I guess one of the things that, having worked with lots of different groups and at different sizes and different sectors over the last several years, one of the things that I'm really noticing is that possibly more than any industry I've worked in before, these sorts of immersive experiences have to be interdisciplinary by design. Like, they do not exist if there are not multiple disciplines working together. And I know that's true for a lot of the work that you do in this room as well. So it may not feel like too uncomfortable a place to embrace this idea of interdisciplinarity. But I think when it comes to actually starting to make the work, people often have a panicky moment where they don't really know how their previous team structures, their previous working practices, their skill sets might play in. What do they need that's new? What do they already have? It can be quite a tricky thing to navigate to start with. So I'm going to, at the request of those who asked me to talk about, I'm going to try and lay some of it out a little bit for you today. And also I am around, so if anybody wants to talk about particular projects and what you need to build a positive collaborative model around that, I'm always happy to be bought coffee. So as you've probably seen from my examples, this idea of XR or immersion is a very broad umbrella. I'm sure we'll get more refined language for it as we get more familiar with it, but it's a massive broad church, and the types of teams that you need and the collaborative models that you will choose will vary very particularly, and clients may not always understand that. They're like, it's an immersive thing. It's very different depending on the tools and technologies that you choose. So as a sort of a first pass, there's a sort of this kind of team that tends to coalesce around 360 filmmaking. So some of you will recognise some of these as quite familiar roles from traditional filmmaking. Often the people that work on these things will have started in more kind of traditional broadcast and film environments and will have commuted their skills to kind of move into this space. But you're still looking at basically this kind of moment of capture, of edit and of post-production that creates this kind of work. There's a bit of extra jiggery-pokery that involves getting it in headsets, but it's becoming a negligible bit of jiggery-pokery. When you get into more kind of constructed CGI sort of animation, virtual reality particularly, although same applies for augmented reality, the team tends to go up quite a lot, and so the costs tend to go up quite a lot. At this point, you do tend to need people who are pretty competent with games engines, for example, developer community. You'll often need more support in terms of that kind of pre-production moment to make sure that you don't invest all of your money in the developer time before you really know what you need. So there's a sort of a wider community of people. I will say, before everybody panics and decides to never do this, what tends to happen in the immersive sector is that everybody's got about 4 of these jobs. Depending on your sort of time frame and budget, you'll be looking a lot often for generalists and people who can kind of straddle a lot of different territories. But there are some quite particular jobs that need to be considered. So things like asset designers, things like animators, things like people who can effectively rig characters so that it's not just a static 3D object, but it's one that can twiddle about. These things are quite specialised skills. So you need to kind of understand enough about what you're doing to know what's needed. Small shout out for host and vigilator. People always forget these are part of their team. But particularly because things like virtual reality are still quite novel technologies, and because they can be really affecting and they can be quite sort of psychologically jarring to go from this to your own expansive universe like a TARDIS and then to come out again, it can be really psychologically confusing. And there's all sorts of reasons why you should really think about who is going to put this experience into action. Is it going to happen in the home? And that onboarding, offboarding has to be done by the user. Is it going to happen in a conference space? Is it going to happen in a theme park? Is it going to happen somewhere else? What do you need to make sure that you can really responsibly bring your user in and out of a quite spectacular shift between realities? So these are all people who should be in your team. And then this is a much sort of more sparse picture because I'm thinking a bit here about AR filters. And I don't know if has anybody made AR filters? Not really. So easy. I mean, to get them really good and to get them really sophisticated is more challenging. But to kind of grow this community of makers and to proliferate this technology, Facebook and Snapchat in particular have released these incredibly usable tools. Snapchat have a thing called Lens Studio. Facebook have a thing which has now gone out of my brain. Just have a little Google, that allows you to make things for Instagram and for Snapchat particularly, but also often across platforms, with lots of templates, with lots of options. And if you just have a little faff about, you can get really effective filters really quickly. And it can be a very sort of short route to market if you want to have something that is particular to a moment in time. They usually have to go through a moderation process, so you have to kind of conform to various codes of standards that these platforms have. But generally, it's a much kind of leaner way to start playing with immersive tech. And you still need talented, super awesome humans, but usually fewer of them. In terms of what I think makes the collaborations work, I'm going to start with what I think doesn't work. And I've seen this so often, and even this week, I'm firefighting because this happened again. Don't do this. Don't put creative over here and put technical over here and draw a big red line down them and imagine that they're different. I know that we sort of know this from the design sector. We've been trying to tell each other this for a long time. But for whatever reason, it's still really prevalent. I think because immersive tech often requires these sort of specialist technical skills, there's a temptation to go like, that's over there now, because I don't know what that is. And this developer here will just have to like make what I want because I'm creative. Or this creative person will have to deal with what I'm dealing with because I'm technical and I know what the limitations are. And so you get these kind of like battle lines drawn. And the astute of you will notice I've slightly arbitrarily put some of these people in categories. Like there's a bunch of these ones that could be on either side. I love the fact people are taking pictures of this. I'm saying don't do this. Just make sure you put a big no on your picture. And it can be really damaging, and I tell you why. When you start to work on these kinds of objects and artifacts and experiences, pretty quickly you discover that you don't have as much money as you thought you did, and you don't have as much time, and that you've slightly chowed through all of your resource, and then you get to the blame. There's been a brilliant discussion about blame, but so often these things fall apart because there's been a massive failure of understanding by this arbitrary distinction between creative and technical that means that someone who regards themselves as creative will be furious that this highly paid developer has made them the wrong thing, or has made them something that didn't work, or has spent all their time and money and now it looks like a PlayStation 2 character. Because it does, because you asked them to make something in Unity. And you didn't know that. You didn't know that to make something in Unity was at that kind of level with that kind of budget was to basically be cool with the fact that there's a lot of optimization that has to happen. The pixel counts have to be super low. The capacity for sound goes way down if you want to get it on a Quest and put it in anyone's hands. The potential to bring in complexity and sophistication and beautiful design has been knocked under the table because you didn't know that it would be if you asked them to make 3 riggable characters that talk to each other. And the developers over here going, obviously it looks like a PlayStation 2 character. You didn't tell me, and I've been working really hard, and now I feel undervalued, and now I hate you, and you get paid too much anyway, and we're not playing together, and I am off to my other highly paid job. So all that's really there is it's not that people are being bad at their jobs. Everyone's working hard, and everyone's applying the expertise that they have. But there is a fundamental gap of understanding in this kind of nascent moment for the sector. In what it is to make an immersive experience, and what's needed, and what small compromises mean for each other, and for what the potentials are. And you can often miss opportunities to make really amazing things together because people here don't know, and there's an unwillingness to talk to each other from the start. So I guess partly what I'm suggesting is that everybody should take it as their responsibility if they're going to work on these things, to learn a bit about it. I often hear people saying, well, you wouldn't ask a camera person to do the edit in a film. Like, yes, but I bet that camera person knows what an editor is. They may not know how to do it, but they kind of know what that process is. They have a kind of common language around what it takes to make a movie. And I think because we all should just acknowledge we don't really know what this is yet, there is a period of learning that we can all kind of do for each other. It's not about becoming a specialist in everything or picking a team and then kind of condescending to someone on an imagined other team. But there is a basic level of literacy that we need to kind of aspire to collectively, so that when it comes to doing this work together, we understand a little bit about what ideas and changes mean for each other. So if we can go from Collab-rubbish to Collab-brilliant, I might have written this quite late at night. What are the things that we need to do together? How can we make this work? So I've slightly arrogantly attempted some rules. Here we go. I think everyone needs to know a little bit about everything. And there are ways that you can do that. A little bit of gentle kind of YouTube searching, a little bit of asking questions of people you work with, a little bit of self-motivated learning can go a super, super long way. It's a bit like going on holiday to Spain and knowing how to ask for a beer in Spanish. Like, you don't really speak the language, but you can ask for a beer in it, and that's like a gesture of goodwill that gets a long way. Ideally, and I know this is hard from a project management point of view and a resource point of view, but in terms of the long game, ideally, really do your level best to try and involve the entire team at the earliest moments. I've seen lots of different versions of this shakedown over the years, and there's a sort of a false economy in this idea that you have your core team and then you expand out at the end when you know what you're doing. With immersive experiences particularly, what that tends to mean is that there's a core team of people who really know why you're doing what you're doing. They're heavily invested. They've had all of this kind of wonderful ideation process together. They know the underpinning values. They know who the audience is going to be. They know what success looks like. They really have some tacit understanding together. And then you get to deployment, and all of these people who have spectacular impact into whether or not that happens or not don't have that tacit understanding. If that secondary group, as you've sort of constructed it, doesn't have that tacit understanding and hasn't been involved in that process and care about the things that should be cared about for it to be successful as this sort of grand experiment that you're doing together, then they will cost you money effectively, and it's not their fault. They will enact things as they see it. And there is so much misunderstanding in this sector, and there are so many projects that never really got off the first stage because they effectively kind of got to that second tier of people who did something you didn't expect, and they had to burn the project because they were out of time and money. So if you can find a way, even in like the first session, to set those goals together, to kind of figure out what you care about together, regardless of what people's technical specialisms are, what people's roles in the projects are going to be. If you can get like your host and invigilator in that room too, they'll be a better advocate for your project. That sort of culture setting at the start is not just good for the project, it's like good for the budget sheet too. So try. Language is not universal. It's a little point, but it makes a difference. If you've ever had to sit in a meeting where someone who is doing the coding talks to someone who comes from theatre and watch them try to work out what scripting means, we might all be notionally speaking the same language, but if we were genuinely interdisciplinary, we probably have quite different takes on what language means, and sometimes some like specific clashes. And taking the time to kind of understand what people mean with their jargon, or to ask them not to use jargon at all, or to kind of unpack where what somebody's saying in one word seems to jar with what you think it means, like allowing a bit of a frank and open discussion about whether a script is a thing on a page that you read the words of or a line of code that you write. If you can resolve some of that stuff early doors, it really helps with a sort of common sense of purpose. Changes are easier and harder than you think. So this is true in every walk of life, but I think particularly when we're talking about work, as so much of this immersive stuff is that is made in a games engine or that is made in a software, you'll be really surprised how hard some seemingly small changes are to enact. And if you have a small change that is small to you, please ask someone else who's going to be doing that change, is it small? Often, I think in a lot of teams, a small change will make a massive difference longer doors, but also if you say something like, I would like this character to now have blue shoes, just check that that's not a week's worth of work. It may well be that the shoes were really heavily integrated into the model and they've effectively got to go back to the 3D artist, get it re-sculptured, get it re-rigged, bring the animator back in, put a new line of code in to say that every time the light is there, it doesn't make it look purple. And it can be something that felt really negligible, but actually has massive technical consequences. Or it might be that that's an absolute piece of piss and you want to know the difference. And it may be, if you had this collective conversation with everyone in the team so far, and they know why you want to suddenly make those shoes blue, they might say to you, what if they were kind of glittery hover shoes? I could do that in an hour. And you're like, yeah, I want glittery hover shoes. But they won't kind of come forward with that if they don't know why glittery hover shoes might actually be better than your blue shoes. So trying to understand what changes mean in terms of negligible or spectacular amounts of resource. And then lastly, and I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here because you all have been talking so beautifully about research and usability testing, but this is often a problem that people make, that people encounter when they're trying to make immersive experiences. You don't have enough time to test, or you don't test enough, or you don't test outside of yourselves. We still don't really have many social rituals for how we do these kinds of experiences. And very often, if we've tried one thing, it'll be completely different to the next thing that we encounter. It can be really difficult for users to work out what is expected of them and what they're entitled to. When we've done testing with various experiences, you'll have 5 people who sit in the chair and will not move. And you're like, you can look around. They're like, no, because I'm used to sitting here and I like what's in front of me. And then you get one person who's immediately out of the chair and starts running around and crashes into the wall because they're kind of into that more exploratory behaviour. But you don't really know that until you test with a bunch of people. And people do weird stuff, especially in headsets. It kind of surfaces lots of very individual responses. So particularly if you're doing headset-based stuff, but frankly, anything that is this sort of slightly unfamiliar paradigm, testing is going to be your friend, and leaving space to actually do something about those testing results will really pay dividends when it comes to the kind of respectful, collaborative way that you can move forward with the project. So yeah, test with not yourself. You might expect something is going to be the case, and then all the humans confound that. You can see for yourself. Some of you have. I forgot to mention, I teach a master's in virtual and extended realities just over the water in Arnolfini. Come do one. But also, today you can see one of our amazing graduates from a couple of years ago, Ayush Dadia, has got a piece called Under the Himalayan Shadow, which is a glorious, beautiful, emotional story about a community of people who live in the foothills of the Himalayas in tandem with a colony of snow leopards, and his journey as a filmmaker in trying to uncover that story and to discover that environment. It's a really amazing way of feeling that you are there and having a very different kind of documentary-based response to conversations about the natural world and about the way that we live lightly on the earth. So do check that out if you get a go. The other way to have a next step, if this has kind of tickled your fancy, I guess, is who knows about IXDA? Some, yay! It's the Interaction Design Association, which is an international organisation of volunteers who put together events and talks and happenings and workshops and things. There are chapters around the world. To the best of my knowledge, there's never been one in Bristol, which seems silly given you. So as of 2 days ago, myself and my colleague Tom Metcalf have agreed to set up the Bristol chapter. We're going to do something with that. I would love to talk to all of you about what we should do with that. If you would like to propose yourself as a speaker or you have ideas for how that should go, we're aiming for a first event, probably with the International Interaction Design Day at the end of September. So do follow us on Twitter. That exists now. And also come see me and have chats.